They say a human being will die without sleep, but in a secret Soviet facility, 5 men discovered something far worse. Forced to stay awake for 15 days by an experimental gas, they didn't just lose their sanity, they uncovered a truth never meant to be known. Sleep was not rest. It was a barrier, and when the eyes never closed, what awakened was not survival, but the thing that had been waiting for humanity to fall unconscious. In the aftermath of World War II, when the world was still bleeding and trust was a luxury no nation could afford, the Soviet Union turned its attention inward. Beneath layers of secrecy and snow-covered forests, a facility was constructed far from any city, village, or marked road. Officially, it did not exist. No maps recorded it. No families knew who worked there. Those who entered were expected to forget the outside world or be forgotten by it. The facility stood like a concrete scar in the Siberian wilderness, surrounded by rusted barbed wire and watchtowers that cut through the fog like silent sentinels. The air was permanently cold, sharp enough to burn the lungs. Even during daylight, the sun struggled to penetrate the thick clouds that hovered above, as if the sky itself wished to hide what happened below. Inside, fluorescent lights flickered endlessly, casting pale reflections along sterile corridors. The smell of metal, disinfectant, and damp concrete filled every room. Scientists in white coats moved with calculated precision, speaking in hushed voices, aware that every word could be recorded, every mistake punished. Fear was as much a part of the facility as the walls themselves. This was where Project S-15 was born. The goal was simple, in theory: to study the limits of human consciousness when deprived of sleep. Soviet intelligence believed that soldiers who did not require rest could change the future of warfare. What they failed or refused to consider was the cost. 5 subjects were selected from political prisons across the country. There were men who had already been erased from society, labeled traitors, dissidents, enemies of the state. Their names had been replaced with numbers long ago. To the government, they were expendable. To the experiment, they were perfect. They were transported at night, blindfolded and shackled, loaded into trucks that drove 4 hours through endless white landscapes. No one spoke during the journey. The prisoners felt the road disappear beneath them, replaced by something deeper, colder-like, descending into the earth itself. When the blindfolds were removed, they stood inside a large observation chamber. The room was bare, illuminated by harsh lights embedded in the ceiling. Thick reinforced glass covered one wall, allowing researchers to observe without being seen. There were no cameras. Technology was unreliable in the presence of the experimental gas planned for use. Instead, the scientists would watch directly, writing notes by hand. The chamber contained no beds, no clocks, no mirrors, only a toilet, a water pipe, and a stack of military rations designed to last over 2 weeks. A senior researcher stepped forward, his expression empty, rehearsed. "You will remain inside this chamber for 15 days, he sighed calmly. "You will be exposed to a gas that prevents sleep. If you survive the full duration, you will be granted your freedom." The word freedom echoed in the chamber. The men exchanged glances. Suspicion was natural, but desperation was stronger. For prisoners who had spent years in darkness, isolation, and pain, even a false promise was something to hold on to. "What happens if we fall asleep?" one of them asked. The researcher paused only briefly. "That will be considered a failure." No further explanation was given. They were instructed that the gas was odorless, invisible, and non-lethal. The chamber door, a thick steel barrier, was sealed from the outside. As it closed, the sound echoed like a coffin lid being shut. From the observation room, scientists activated the gas release system. A faint hiss filled the chamber, barely noticeable. The men coughed lightly at first, then adjusted. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt dangerous. Yet as the door locked and the lights remained on without flicker, an unspoken realization settled among the observers. Once the experiment began, there would be no interference, no rescue, no mercy. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the facility in silence while inside, 5 minds stood at the edge of something far more terrifying than sleep deprivation, something waiting to be awakened. The word freedom lingered in the air, long after the chamber door had sealed shut. For the 5 men inside, it was not merely a concept, it was a wound that never healed. Each of them carried a different memory of what freedom once meant. A home, a family, a voice that could be used without fear. Now, it had been reduced to a conditional reward, dangling just out of reach. At first, the men sat quietly, measuring the space, measuring each other. No one trusted anyone. Years of imprisonment had taught them that silence was safer than honesty. The gas continued to flow invisibly, filling their lungs with every breath, though none of them could feel its presence. Eventually, one of the men broke the silence. 15 days? He muttered. They think we can stay awake for 15 days. Another laughed softly, shaking his head. They don't think. They know we will fail. The third man, older than the rest, remained seated against the wall. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling lights, unblinking. They wouldn't offer freedom if failure was guaranteed, he said slowly. They need something from us. That idea settled heavily among them. They began to talk, not because they trusted each other, but because the alternative was their own thoughts. Stories emerged cautiously at first. Where they were from, how they had been arrested, what crimes they had supposedly committed. None of them claimed innocence outright. In the Soviet system, guilt was irrelevant. As hours passed, the men realized something strange. Fatigue did not arrive. Normally, the body demanded rest, muscles weakened, eyelids grew heavy, thoughts blurred. But now, their minds felt sharp and comfortably so. Every sound was amplified. Every movement seemed too loud, too deliberate. One man paced the chamber endlessly, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Another organized and reorganized the rations, stacking and restacking them as if order itself might keep him sane. Behind the glass, the researchers observed in silence, clipboards filled with notes, heart rate stable, no signs of drowsiness. This is better than expected, one scientist whispered. Another did not respond. His eyes were fixed on the prisoner's face as on the way they stared too long at nothing. Several hours into the experiment, the men attempted to test the rules. They knocked on the glass, shouting questions, demanding clarification. The chamber swallowed their voices. No reply came. The glass did not even vibrate. That was when the reality of the promise began to crack. Freedom was no longer a reward, it was a leash. Without clocks, time became distorted. The lights never dimmed. Hunger arrived in predictable waves, but exhaustion did not. Their bodies obeyed laws that no longer made sense. By what they guessed was the second day, conversation grew more erratic. Laughter came to Isley at nothing. Jokes repeated themselves until they lost meaning. One man began to speak rapidly, jumping between subjects, his thoughts spilling out faster than the others could follow. Another man stopped talking entirely. He sat cross-legged near the corner, eyes wide, watching the others with quiet intensity. When asked if he was feeling well, he only smiled, a thin, unsettling expression that never reached his eyes. Behind the glass, the observers noted the first signs of psychological instability. Early onset agitation, one wrote. No sleep pressure detected, wrote another. Late into the cycle, one of the men asked the question none of them wanted to voice. What if they never opened the door? No one answered, because they all understood the truth. Prisoners did not matter. Results deep. That night, if it could be called nights, something changed. The air felt heavier, thicker, as if breathing required more effort. The men became irritable, snapping at small noises, accusing each other of staring, of whispering. One man suddenly pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging the surface. They're watching, he whispered. They never stop watching. From the observation room, a researcher involuntarily stepped back. For the first time, doubt crept into the minds of those in control. The promise of freedom had done its job. It had convinced 5 broken men to step willingly into a cage. But as the gas continued to flow and sleep remained absent, it became clear that freedom was never the true purpose of the experiment. It was the bait, and something far darker had already begun to answer the call. The chamber had never felt smaller. What was once an empty room now seemed to close in on the 5 men, its concrete walls pressing inward with invisible weight. The air circulated constantly, yet it felt stale, as if it had been breathed too many times already. The faint hiss of the ventilation system never stopped, a quiet reminder that something unseen was always flowing through the room. They had stopped trying to guess the time. Without clocks or shadows, the concept of hours dissolved. The lights above remained mercilessly bright, denying their bodies any signal of rest. Their eyes burned. It refused to close. Blinking felt optional. Sleep felt impossible. One of the men attempted to lie down, pressing his back against the cold floor. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to escape the endless brightness. Within seconds, his heart began to race. His breathing quickened. A sharp panic rose in his chest, forcing his eyes open again. "I can't," he whispered. "I can't shut them." The others watched him carefully. Fear was becoming contagious. They began to notice subtle changes in one another. Hands trembled when they thought no one was looking. Pupils remained unnaturally dilated. Smiles lingered too long, freezing on faces, even after laughter died. The man who had gone quiet in the previous cycle now spoke again, but only to himself. He muttered under his breath, strings of half-formed sentences that made no sense. When asked what he was saying, he shook his head violently. "You wouldn't understand," he replied. "They're not for you." Behind the glass, the researchers adjusted their notes. Subject for shows signs of auditory hallucination. Subject to exhibits increasing motor agitation. All subjects remained fully conscious. No intervention authorized. The chamber door stood motionless, thick steel, sealed tight. The seams had been welded shut from the outside. Even if the men had the strength, there was no escape. The door was not designed to open from within. As if sensing this, one of the prisoners walked up to it and pressed his forehead against the metal. It was ice cold. "They built this like a tomb," he said quietly. Another laughed, but the sound cracked halfway through, collapsing into silence. Paranoia began to bloom. They accused each other of stealing rations, though none were missing. They argued about imagined insults, about looks that lasted too long. One man became convinced that the others were working with the scientists, that this was all a performance designed to break him. At one point, he lunged forward, grabbing another by the collar. "You report everything, don't you?" he shouted. Every word. The fight ended quickly, energy draining from them as fast as it had come. Violence required rest. Rest was no longer available. In the observation room, tension thickened. They're deteriorating faster than predicted. One researcher said. The gas concentration remains stable, another replied. This is within expected parameters. No one mentioned the unease crawling beneath their skin. The men began to avoid the glass wall. At first, it was subconscious. They sat with their backs turned, eyes focused on the floor or the opposite wall. Eventually, it became deliberate. One of them covered the glass with his jacket, blocking the view. "They don't deserve to see us," he said. From the other side, the scientists hesitated but allowed it. Observation continued through narrow gaps at the edges. As the cycle progressed, the first physical symptoms appeared. Dry skin cracked at the knuckles. Lips split and bled. One man scratched at his arms until red marks bloomed beneath his nails. "Something's wrong with my skin," he complained. "It feels too tight." Another began to breathe rapidly for no reason, clutching his chest, convinced his heart was failing. Medical scans showed nothing abnormal. Their bodies were awake. Too awake. Late into the cycle, a sudden realization struck one of them. "If we sleep, we die," he said. The others stared at him. "They said failure," he continued. "They never said what failure means." Silence swallowed the room. That thought took root quickly. From that moment on, closing one's eyes felt dangerous. Yawning was suppressed. Even leaning too comfortably against the wall caused panic. Sleep was no longer a need. It was a threat. Behind the glass, one scientist finally voiced what the others had been avoiding. "What if they don't stop when we want them to?" No one answered, because the truth was clear now. The chamber was not simply sealed from the outside. It was sealed from mercy. And as the gas continued its silent work, something inside the men had begun to harden, something that no longer recognized sleep as part of being human, something that was learning to survive without it. If anyone had asked the men how long they had been inside the chamber, none of them could have answered with certainty. Time no longer moved forward, it folded in on itself. Moments stretched unbearably long, while entire cycles vanished without warning. The human mind, deprived of sleep, had begun to eat itself. At first, they tried to create routines. They divided the rations evenly. They took turns pacing the room. One man suggested they tell stories to keep their thoughts organized. It worked. Briefly, familiar narratives gave shape to the emptiness, anchoring them to something resembling normal life. But repetition poisoned everything. Stories blurred together. The same jokes were told again and again, each time losing more meaning. Laughter came too loud, too sudden, then died abruptly, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. The lights never dimmed. Eyes burned constantly. Tears foamed without emotion, spilling down cheeks simply because the body demanded relief. Blinking became painful, yet necessary. The men began rubbing their faces raw, desperate to feel something other than awareness. One of them started counting. At first, he counted footsteps while pacing the chamber, then breaths, then heartbeats. When asked why, he said, "If I stop counting, I don't know where I am." Eventually, he forgot what number he was on and collapsed against the wall, sobbing not from sadness, but from frustration. Behind the glass, the researchers observed subtle but undeniable shifts. Speech patterns had changed. Sentences trailed off. Eye contact became aggressive or entirely absent. Emotional responses no longer matched situations. This level of cognitive strain shouldn't be possible yet, a junior scientist whispered. The senior researcher didn't look away from the chamber. We are witnessing something unprecedented. Inside, physical discomfort intensified. Muscles ached constantly, as if the men had been running for days without stopping. Joints stiffened. One man complained that his teeth hurt, a deep, throbbing sensation that made no sense. Another developed a persistent tremor in his hands, fingers twitching uncontrollably. Sleep should have come. It never did. Instead, hallucinations began creeping into the edges of perception. Shadows moved when no one passed by. The sound of breathing echoed in the room even when all 5 men were silent. One of them swore he could hear someone whispering his name from inside the walls. When confronted, the others accused him of lying until they began hearing things too. A low hum beneath the constant hiss of the gas. Footsteps. Behind them, laughter that didn't belong to anyone in the room. Paranoia became their common language. They watched one another constantly, searching for signs of weakness. Closing one's eyes for even a second invited suspicion. A yawn earned sharp looks. Leaning too comfortably against the wall sparked accusations of trying to sleep. "You're going to ruin this for all of us," one man hissed after seeing another rest his head briefly against his knees. "I wasn't sleeping," the man snapped back. "I was thinking." The line between thought and dream had already begun to dissolve. The man who had once covered the glass now refused to face it at all. He claimed that if he looked directly at the observers, they would be able to see inside his head. "They know when I think about sleeping," he said. "They punish me for it." No punishment came yet. His fear remained absolute. From the observation room, concerns were raised. "We should consider reducing the duration," one researcher suggested quietly. "The data's too valuable," came the reply. "We proceed." Late into the cycle, one of the men suddenly burst into laughter. It started softly, a trembling chuckle, then escalated into something wild and uncontrollable. He doubled over, clutching his stomach, gasping for breath as tears streamed down his face. "What's funny?" another demanded. The laughter stopped instantly. The man looked up, eyes glassy, smile frozen unnaturally wide. "I don't know," he said. "I just realized I don't miss sleeping." The room fell silent. That admission frightened them more than any hallucination. Sleep had once been a refuge. A reset, a place where pain softened, thoughts quieted. Now, the idea of unconsciousness felt foreign, almost dangerous, as if surrendering control, even briefly, meant something would be lost forever. Behind the glass, heart rate monitors showed a disturbing trend. Elevated but stable. as though the bodies had accepted their condition. Adapted. As the days without sleep continued, the men were no longer merely enduring the experiment. They were changing, and whatever they were becoming no longer measured time in days or nights, only in moments of unbearable awareness, stretching endlessly forward with no promise of rest. Sleep was fading from memory, and with it, something essential to being human was quietly slipping away. There was no scream, no sudden collapse, just a subtle shift, something intangible slipping out of place. The men could feel it, even if they could not name it, like a thought that escaped before it could be finished. They were no longer simply tired. Their minds had begun to splinter. One of them, Subject 3, became obsessed with the walls. He ran his fingers along the concrete repeatedly, pressing his ear against it, listening intently. When asked what he was doing, he answered without turning around. "There's space behind it," he said. "Not empty space, living space." The others exchanged uneasy looks. "There's nothing there," someone replied. Subject 3 smiled faintly. "That's what they want you to think." Arguments erupted more frequently now, often without cause. A glance held too long became an accusation. A misplaced ration sparked shouting matches that drained what little energy remained. The gas kept them alert, but it did nothing to soften their emotions. If anything, it sharpened them to a painful edge. Anger arrived fast and burned hot. One man suddenly accused another of trying to sabotage the experiment by secretly sleeping. "I saw your eyes close," he shouted. "You're trying to kill us." The accused swore it wasn't true, but the room had already turned against him. Voices rose, hands clenched. For a moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. Then it passed, just as suddenly as it had come. They stood there, breathing hard, confused by their own reactions. Behind the glass, the researchers marked another observation. Group cohesion deteriorating rapidly, heightened aggression, delusional ideation emerging. No intervention. The men's thoughts no longer followed linear paths. Memories surfaced at random childhood homes, forgotten songs, faces of people they were no longer sure had ever existed. One man began speaking to someone who wasn't there, addressing them by name, arguing, apologizing. When asked who he was talking to, he looked genuinely surprised. "You didn't hear her?" he asked. The others backed away. Sleep deprivation was supposed to cause fatigue, hallucinations, eventual collapse. This was something else. Their sense of self began to erode. One man stared at his hands for an uncomfortably long time, flexing his fingers as though seeing them for the first time. "They don't feel like mine," he said quietly. Another man scratched at his forearms until blood welled up, convinced that something was crawling beneath his skin. The pain seemed to ground him, proof that he was still real. From the observation room, a younger scientist shifted uneasily. "We're crossing an ethical threshold," he said. The senior researcher did not respond. His eyes were locked on the chamber. "They agreed," he said finally. They knew the terms. But even he could not ignore what was unfolding. Inside, Subject 5 began refusing to eat. He claimed the rations were being poisoned through the gas. When hunger overwhelmed him, he chewed mechanically, gagging, eyes filled with suspicion. "They want us weak," he muttered. "So we'll beg to sleep." The word sleep had become forbidden. Mentioning it caused visible distress. One man clutched his head and screamed for the speaker to stop, insisting that the idea alone made his heart race uncontrollably. Sleep was no longer rest. It was annihilation. Late into the cycle, Subject suddenly collapsed to his knees, pressing his palms against his temples. "There are too many thoughts," he gasped. "They won't stop. They're all happening at once." The others watched helplessly as he rocked back and forth, whispering fragments of sentences that overlapped and contradicted each other. Behind the glass, brain activity readings spiked erratically. "This shouldn't be sustainable," a researcher murmured. Yet the men remained awake. Pain, hunger, fear, none of which shut them down. Something had changed at a fundamental level. The gas was no longer merely preventing sleep. It was stripping away the barriers that protected the mind from itself. As the cycle continued, trust vanished completely. They slept rested in shifts, not because it helped, but because it made them feel safer to watch one another. Even when sitting still, their eyes never fully relaxed. One man whispered a confession into the corner of the room, convinced the walls were listening. Another laughed quietly at nothing, rocking back and forth, eyes unfocused. Cracks in the mind widened into fractures. And through those fractures, something dark began to surface, something patient, something ancient, something that had been kept at bay by sleep for as long as humanity had existed. The experiment had not yet reached its most horrific phase, but the men inside the chamber were already breaking. And broken minds, once pushed far enough, do not simply shatter. They transform. One moment, the chamber was filled with the usual low murmur of restless movement, footsteps, muttering, the constant hiss of the gas. The next, it was shattered by a sound so raw, so violently human, that it froze everyone in place. Subject 1 had been sitting near the wall, knees drawn to his chest, eyes fixed on nothing. Without standing, without inhaling, he opened his mouth and screamed. It was not a cry for help. It was not pain. It was terror, given a voice. The sound tore through the chamber, echoing off the concrete walls, vibrating through the glass. His throat strained immediately, but he did not stop. He screamed as if something inside him had finally broken free, as if silence itself had become unbearable. The other men stared in horror. "Stop!" one of them shouted, rushing toward him. "Stop it!" Subject 1 did not react. His eyes were wide open, blood vessels rupturing, tears streaming down his face as the scream continued uninterrupted, relentless. Behind the glass, chaos erupted. "He's screaming," a researcher said unnecessarily, fumbling with his notes. "How long has it been?" another asked. "Minutes passed." The scream did not fade. Subject 1's voice began to change, turning hoarse, shredding itself apart. Blood trickled from the corners of his mouth as vocal cords tore under the strain. Still, he did not stop. His body convulsed, muscles locking. Yet the sound persisted, uglier now, broken, but just as desperate. The other subjects backed away, covering their ears. "Make him stop," one of them yelled at the glass, pounding on it with both fists. "Please." No response came. The observers hesitated. Protocol dictated no interference unless all subjects were unresponsive. A scream, no matter how prolonged, did not qualify. "He'll exhaust himself," the senior researcher said, though his voice lacked conviction. But exhaustion never arrived. Hour after hour, the scream continued. Not continuously loud, sometimes it dipped into a ragged wheeze, but it never truly stopped. It became part of the environment, as constant as the gas, as oppressive as the light. Eventually, there was a wet, choking sound. Subject 1 collapsed forward, hands clawing at the floor. His scream dissolved into a silent gape. He tried to inhale and failed. His chest convulsed uselessly. No sound came out anymore. His voice was gone. The chamber fell into a new kind of silence, one heavier than before. The other men stared at him. He lay there, gasping soundlessly, eyes still wide with terror. When he finally inhaled properly, it came in short, panicked bursts. His throat was destroyed. Whatever he had tried to release with that scream had taken his voice with it. Something else was missing too. He did not look relieved. He looked empty. Behind the glass, no one spoke for a long time. That wasn't hysteria, a scientist finally whispered. That was something else. Inside the chamber, the scream had changed everything. The remaining men no longer whispered about hallucinations or paranoia. They no longer argued. They watched Subject 1 from a distance, as though he were contagious. When one of them finally approached, kneeling beside him, Subject 1 did not respond. His eyes followed movement, but there was no recognition behind them. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, only a faint, wet rasp escaped. "Can you hear us?" the man asked. Subject 1 smiled. It was not a comforting expression. It was too wide, too deliberate. That smile broke something in the others. From that moment on, fear took a new form. They were no longer afraid of sleep. They were afraid of what staying awake was turning them into. The chamber felt different now. Smaller, louder. The walls seemed closer. Every breath felt intrusive, as though the gas itself was listening. One man pressed his hands against his ears and began rocking back and forth, "I don't want to scream," he whispered. "I don't want to scream like that." Another stared at the ceiling lights, eyes twitching. "What did he see?" he asked, no one in particular. "What did he see that we didn't?" Behind the glass, a heated argument broke out. "We have to stop this," a researcher insisted. "We've crossed the line. The data is irreplaceable," the senior scientist snapped back. "Do you know what this means?" What it meant was terrifying. The scream had not been a breakdown. It had been a release. Something inside Subject 1 had reached a pressure point and, instead of collapsing, as the gas continued to flow and the men remained mercilessly awake, one truth became unavoidable. The first scream was not the end. It was the beginning, and now that the silence had been broken, whatever was lurking beneath their thoughts knew how to come out. The chamber existed in a state of quiet instability, like a structure already collapsing but not yet fallen. The silence left behind by Subject 1's ruined voice was worse than the sound itself. It pressed against the remaining men, filling every corner of their thoughts. Subject 1 no longer spoke. He moved occasionally slow, deliberate motions, but only when necessary. When he wasn't moving, he sat perfectly still, staring ahead with that same unnatural smile frozen on his face. His eyes no longer tracked people. They tracked space, as if watching something just beyond visibility. The others avoided him. Madness did not arrive all at once. It spread the way rut does, slow, quiet, inevitable. Subject 3 was the next change. He began scratching at his chest, lightly at first, then harder. When blood appeared beneath his fingernails, he seemed relieved. "It's real," he whispered. "I'm still real." They tried to stop him. He shoved them away with surprising strength, continuing to tear at his own skin until red streaks covered his torso. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. Pain, it seemed, was no longer registered the way it should have been. Behind the glass, heart rate monitors spiked. "Self-mutilation," a researcher said quietly. "No anesthetic response," another added. Still, no intervention was authorized. Subject 5 began talking to the walls. At first, it sounded like prayer. Then argument. Then blathing. He pressed his forehead against the concrete, whispering urgently, as if afraid of being overheard. "They said if I stay awake, they'll leave me alone," he murmured. "They promised." When asked who they were, he shook his head violently. "You don't want to know," he said. "They don't like to be named." Subject 2, once the most aggressive, withdrew completely. He sat in the corner, arms wrapped around his legs, rocking back and forth. His lips moved constantly, but no sound came out. His eyes darted wildly, following shapes that no one else could see. The men were no longer a group. They were isolated minds sharing the same cage. Sleep deprivation had stripped away social bonds, empathy, restraint. Each man existed inside his own private nightmare, barely aware of the others except as threats. Subject 1 suddenly stood up. The movement startled everyone. He walked slowly to the center of the chamber and looked at each of them in turn. His gaze lingered, assessing, calculating. When he reached Subject 3, still bleeding lightly from his chest, he tilted his head. "You're doing it wrong," he rasped. The sound was horrifying, wet, broken, barely human. Before anyone could react, Subject 1 reached out and dug his fingers into Subject 3's wound. The scream that followed was short and sharp. The others pulled him away, shouting, panicking. But Subject 1 resisted fiercely, strength fueled by something far beyond adrenaline. When he was finally pushed back, he left or tried to. The sound came out as a choking wheeze. "Inside," he whispered. "It's all inside." Behind the glass, the room erupted. "We have to end this," a scientist shouted. "They're killing each other." The senior researcher slammed his fist on the table. "Not yet." The data scrolling across the monitors was unlike anything ever recorded. Brain activity patterns no longer resembled normal human cognition. Something else was operating, something raw, instinctive, stripped of higher function yet disturbingly focused. Inside the chamber, fear had transformed. They were no longer afraid of dying. They were afraid of losing control. Subject 5 suddenly began laughing hysterically, clutching his stomach. I can hear him thinking, he gasped. "All of you, it's so loud." Subject who screamed for him to stop, covering his ears, rocking harder. The gas continued to flow. Hour by hour, their bodies degraded while their minds remained trapped in relentless awareness. Pain no longer served as a warning. Hunger became an afterthought. Blood dried on skin and was ignored. Subject 3 collapsed from blood loss, not enough to kill him, but enough to weaken him. As he lay on the floor, Subject 1 crouched beside him, watching intently. "If you let go," he whispered, "it gets quieter." No one knew what he meant, or perhaps they did, and that terrified them even more. Behind the glass, the observers finally realized the truth they had been avoiding. The experiment was no longer about sleep deprivation. The gas had peeled back something fundamental, exposing a layer of the human mind never meant to remain awake. Madness was no longer spreading. It had already won. And as the men inside the chamber descended further into self-destruction and violence, one horrifying question remained unanswered. When the experiment and Diffit Verdidwa would be left to wake up, behind the reinforced glass, the observers sat in rigid silence, eyes locked on the broken figures moving within. The men they had sealed inside were barely recognizable as human subjects now. They were phenomena unpredictable, unstable, and profoundly wrong. The observation room, once a place of clinical order, had become tense and disordered. Coffee cups went untouched. Notes were half-written and abandoned. No one trusted their own conclusions anymore. They shouldn't still be conscious, a young researcher whispered. By every medical standard, they should be comatose or dead. The senior researcher said nothing. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the microphone controls. Communication had been avoided until now. Protocol discouraged interaction once psychological degradation reached advanced stages. Words could influence behavior. Influence could contaminate data. But silence had become unbearable. He pressed a button. "Can you hear us?" His voice echoed faintly into the chamber. The reaction was immediate. All remaining subjects turned toward the glass at once. The synchronization was unnatural. Subject 1 stepped forward slowly, dragging one foot behind him. His ruined throat produced a wet clicking sound as he tried to speak. When no words came, he smiled again, that same deliberate, knowing expression. "Yes," Subject 5 answered instead, his voice calm, almost cheerful. "We've always heard you." The room went cold. "You haven't spoken to us before," the researcher said carefully. Subject 5 tilted his head. "You never asked the right questions." Behind the glass, several scientists exchanged glances. One of them reached instinctively for the emergency release controls, then hesitated. "What are you experiencing?" the senior researcher asked. Laughter rippled through the chamber. Not from one man, from all of them. It was disjointed and uneven, but unmistakably shared. "We're awake," Subject 2 said softly. "More awake than you." The researcher's fear sharpened into something deeper. This was no longer delirium. This was coherence. "What do you want?" the senior researcher asked. Subject 1 raised his head slowly, eyes locking onto the glass. He pressed his palm against it, leaving behind a faint smear of blood. "The gas," he rasped. "Don't let it stop." A murmur of agreement followed. "Please," Subject 3 added weakly from the floor. "If we sleep, they come back." "Who?" a scientist demanded. Unable to stop himself, the men fell silent. Their eyes shifted not toward the researchers, but inward, as if listening. "Us," Subject 5 finally said. "The parts you buried." The senior researcher stepped back. That was when the first equipment failure occurred. A monitor flickered violently, then went dark. Another followed. Static crackled through the speakers, distorting the audio feed into a low, pulsing hum. "This isn't possible," someone muttered. The gas shouldn't affect electronics. But it was. Lights dimmed briefly, then returned to full brightness. The hum deepened, resonating in the chest, vibrating through bone. Inside the chamber, the subjects reacted with visible relief. "Yes," Subject 5 whispered. "That's better." Panic spread through the observation room. "We need to shut this down," a scientist said. "Right now." "And do what?" another replied. Open the chamber. You saw what they've become. The emergency protocol was clear. If the subjects became a threat to personnel, lethal force was authorized, but no one moved. Because no one wanted to be the one to end it, or to find out what would happen if they didn't. The senior researcher stared at the glass, at the blood, the hollow eyes, the broken bodies that still refused rest. We're not observing anymore, he said quietly. We're provoking. Another equipment failure sparked. Alarms chirped, then fell silent. Inside the chamber, Subject 1 began tapping the glass with his knuckles slow. Deliberate taps that echoed through the room. Tap, tap. Each sound tightened the observer's nerves. He knows we're afraid, a researcher whispered. The senior researcher swallowed hard. He knows we're trapped too. Because the truth had become undeniable. The facility was isolated. Communications outside were limited. If the experiment ended catastrophically, there would be no immediate rescue. The men in the chamber were locked inside, but so were the scientists. Subject 5 leaned close to the glass. Eyes gleaming. You wanted to see what happens when humans don't sleep? He said softly. Now you're watching what keeps you sane. The microphone crackled violently, then cut out. Silence fell. No gas adjustments responded. No systems answered commands. The facility itself seemed to hesitate. And in that terrible pause, every observer understood the same horrifying realization. They had not merely removed sleep from the subjects. They had removed the barrier between thought and instinct, between consciousness and whatever waits beneath it. And now, whatever had been awakened was no longer content to remain on the other side of the glass. It knew it was being watched, and it was watching back. The clocks in the control room insisted the experiment had reached its intended duration, but the facility itself felt suspended, caught between moments, as though reluctant to move forward. The gas continued to circulate. The chamber lights remained unchanged, and inside, something was terribly wrong. There was no movement, no pacing, no whispering, no tapping against the glass. Nothing. For hours, the observers stared into the chamber, straining to detect even the slightest sign of life. 5 bodies lay scattered across the concrete floor, limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Bloodstains had darkened to a dull brown. Skin appeared gray, stretched tight over bone. They're dead, someone finally said. No one argued. Medical readings were inconclusive. Heart monitors flickered erratically, occasionally registering faint spikes too irregular to confirm life. Too consistent to ignore entirely. This can't be right, a researcher murmured. No one survives this long without sleep. The senior researcher leaned forward, his face pale. They weren't surviving, he said quietly. They were persisting. Silence returned. The chamber door loomed large in everyone's thoughts. Protocol demanded verification. If all subjects were deceased, the gas supply was to be shut off and the chamber ventilated before entry, but no one wanted to be the one to give the order. What if they're pretending? A junior scientist asked. What if this is another phase? The idea was absurd, and yet no one dismissed it. The memory of synchronized movement, of coherent speech, of eyes that seemed far too aware it, lingered like a bruise that refused to fade. After prolonged debate, the decision was made. The microphone was reactivated. This is a welfare check, the senior researcher said, his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. If anyone inside can hear us, respond verbally or by movement. The words echoed into the chamber. Nothing happened. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then slowly one hand twitched. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the observation room. The hand belonged to Subjecta. His fingers curled inward, scraping weakly against the floor. The sound was faint, but unmistakable. He's alive, someone whispered. The senior researcher swallowed hard. All subjects, he said into the microphone. The experiment has reached its conclusion. You are to lie still. The gas will be shut off shortly. A pause. Then, Subject 5's voice drifted across the speaker's hoarse, but clear. No. The word hit the room like a physical blow. You promised freedom, he continued. You didn't promise sleep. Subject 1's head lifted slowly. His neck made a sickening sound as it moved. One eye open, bloodshot, unfocused then, fixed directly on the glass. If the gas stops, Subject 3 whispered weakly, we'll dream again. We can't go back, Subject added. We won't survive it. Panic spread through the observers. They're refusing, a researcher said. They don't want the experiment to end. The senior researcher stepped closer to the controls. This is not a negotiation, he sighed firmly. The gas will be turned off. Subject 5 laughed softly. You think this ends when the gas stops? He asked. You think we are the result? The laughter spread low, broken, but unmistakably shared. That was when the monitors spiked violently. Heart rates surged across all 5 readings at once. Brain activity flared into chaotic patterns that defied interpretation. They're responding to the announcement. Someone shouted, gas levels stable. Another replied. They're not panicking. They're anticipating. The senior researcher hesitated. Every instinct screamed that opening the chamber now was a mistake. But protocol was protocol. The gas supply was cut. The hiss faded. For the first time in 15 days, the air inside the chamber was clean. Inside, the men convulsed, not in relief, in terror. Subject 3 screamed, drawn, animal clawing at his own face. Subject to beat his fists against the floor, sobbing incoherently. Subject 5 pressed his forehead to the glass, breathing hard. They're coming back, he whispered. You've let them back in. Subject 1 remained eerily calm. He rose unsteadily to his feet, blood dripping from his mouth, eyes burning with terrible clarity. You should have left us alone, he rasped. Behind the glass, no one spoke, because in that moment, they understood the truth they had been avoiding since the beginning. The experiment had not created monsters. It had revealed what sleep had always kept hidden. And now, as the 10th day ended and the gas dissipated, the researchers were faced with an impossible question. What happens when beings who fear sleep more than death are finally allowed to rest? Protocol demanded sterilization, sedation, and armed containment. None of those conditions were met. The gas had been shut off too abruptly, the ventilation incomplete, and the subjects, if they could still be called, that were anything but stable. Yet, the order was given. The heavy steel locks disengaged one by one, each metallic click echoing through the corridor like a countdown. Armed guards took position on either side of the door, rifles raised, fingers trembling on triggers. Medics stood behind them, faces pale, carrying equipment they all knew would be useless. The senior researcher raised his hand. Open it. The door groaned as it slid aside. The smell hit first. It was thick, rotten, and metallic blood, decay, and something far worse beneath it. Several guards gagged immediately. One turned away, vomiting onto the concrete floor. Inside, the chamber was a slaughterhouse, frozen in time. 3 bodies lay motionless, twisted and partially dismembered. Flesh had been torn open, not by tools, but by human hands. Bite marks were visible along arms and shoulders. Bones protruded at impossible angles. Blood coated the floor in dark, sticky pools. Yet 2 figures still moved. Subject 3 was barely recognizable. His chest cavity had been opened crudely, ribs snapped outward, organs exposed, and still, his lungs expanded weakly, drawing in shallow breaths. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, lips trembling with silent words. The medics froze. He's alive, one whispered. No, another replied, voice shaking. That's not alive. Near the far wall stood Subject 1. He was standing upright, unsupported despite injuries that should have killed him hours ago. Portions of his face were gone. His lips had been chewed away, exposing teeth locked in a permanent grin. His eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, yet burned with terrifying awareness. He looked directly at the researcher. You opened it, he rasped. The sound was wet, bubbling, carried on ruined vocal cords that had no right to function. A guard raised his weapon instinctively. Hold your fire, the senior researcher ordered. Subject 1 took a step forward. Blood dripped from his body with each movement, yet his posture remained unnaturally steady. He glanced briefly at the corpses on the floor, then back at the observers. They couldn't stay awake, he said. They gave in. Subject 3 let out a weak, gurgling sound as if in protest. The senior researcher swallowed hard. "What are you?" he asked quietly. Subject 1 tilted his head, considering the question. "What's left?" he answered. "When sleep stops protecting you." Without warning, Subject 3 convulsed violently. His body arched upward, fingers clawing at the air. A medic rushed forward instinctively and froze as Subject 3's eyes snapped open, pupils blown wide. "Don't," Subject 3 croaked. "If I sleep," his body went limp mid-sentence. Monitors flatlined. Silence fell like a weight. Subject 1 watched the body collapse with mild curiosity. "He's resting now," he said. "That's what you wanted, isn't it?" The guards shifted nervously. "We need to sedate him," one medic whispered. "No sedatives," the senior researcher said. "He's resisted everything else." Subject 1 laughed a broken, rasping sound that scraped against the nerves. "You still think chemicals matter?" he said. "Sleep was the only leash." He took another step forward. The guards fired. The sound of gunshots exploded through the facility. Bullets tore into Subject 1's chest, ripping through flesh and bone. His body jerked violently, stumbling backward, collapsing against the wall. Smoke filled the air. For several seconds, no one moved. Then Subject 1 began to laugh again. He dragged himself upright, using the wall for support. Blood poured freely from multiple wounds, yet his eyes remained locked on the senior researcher. "You can't kill what doesn't rest," he whispered. The guards fired a gaming for the head this time. Subject 1 collapsed. This time, he did not rise. The chamber was silent. Medics rushed in, checking for signs of life. Pulse, absent. Respiration, none. Brain activity, unreadable. "He's dead," someone finally said. No one felt relief. The senior researchers stepped closer, staring down at the body. "What did you see?" he asked softly, though he knew there would be no answer. As they prepared to remove the remains, one of the monitors flickered briefly. A single spike, gone as quickly as it appeared. No one spoke of it. The chamber was sealed again hours later, scrubbed clean, erased as thoroughly as possible. Official reports listed all subjects as deceased due to extreme physiological failure. The experiment was declared a failure, but long after the bodies were burned and the facility abandoned, the senior researchers still woke in cold sweats, heart racing, mind painfully alert. Because in the final moment, just before Subject 1 fell, there had been no fear in his eyes, only pity, as if he knew something about sleep, about what waited behind closed eyes that the rest of the world was never meant to remember. It lingered, thick and watchful, clinging to the chamber even as the guards lowered their weapons and the medics confirmed what protocol demanded. Subject 1 lay motionless on the floor, his ruined body finally still. Blood pooled beneath him, slowly spreading, as if the chamber itself were absorbing what remained. Yet no one moved to leave. The senior researcher stood frozen, staring down at the corpse. His hands shook not from fear of danger, but from the creeping sense that something unfinished still hovered in the air. They had ended the experiment, but the experiment had not released them. As preparations were made to remove the bodies, one of the monitors emitted a faint, irregular beep. Every head snapped toward the sound. "That's impossible," a technician whispered. "There's no cardiac activity." The screen flickered again, another spike, brief and erratic, but unmistakably real. The senior researcher raised a hand. "Stop!" The medics hesitated, against all logic. Subject 1's chest rose. Barely a shallow, broken breath escaped his destroyed throat, followed by a wet cough. One eye twitched open, unfocused at first, then slowly sharpened. Locking onto the senior researcher, a ripple of panic spread through the room. "He's not dead," someone said. "No," another replied. "He was dead." The senior researcher stepped closer, ignoring the shouts behind him. Subject 1's lips, what remained of them, trembled. It took visible effort for him to form words. "You're still awake," he rasped. The senior researcher swallowed. "Yes," he answered quietly. "I am. A faint, distorted smile pulled at Subject One's face. "Good," he whispered. "Then, ask." The room held its breath. "Ask what?" The senior researcher realized, with a sudden chill, that this moment had always been inevitable. Not data, not results, but understanding. Eliando, don't close enough to smell blood and decay. "What are you?" he asked. "Subject Ones," I fluttered. "We told you already," he said weakly. "Where are you?" "Without the lie." The researcher's voice faltered. "What lie?" Subject One's breathing grew shallower. Each word seemed to cost him something irretrievable. "That sleep is just rest," he whispered. "That it's harmless. That it's empty." The monitors began to wail softly. "You believe sleep is absence?" Subject One continued. A pause, a mercy. His eyes shifted upward, staring past the ceiling. "It's not." The senior researcher felt his pulse quicken. "Then what is it?" he asked. Subject One's gaze returned to him, burning with a final clarity. "It's the door." The word echoed in the researcher's mind. "Hey! Doto what? Preset?" Subject One coughed violently, blood bubbling at his throat. A medic moved forward, but the researcher held up his hand. "Every night," Subject One whispered, "your mind lets go. It loosens its grip. It pretends to disappear." The monitors spiked wildly now. "But something else takes its place," he continued. "Something older, quieter, patient." The researcher's mouth felt dry. "That thing," Subject One said, "is always there. Watching, waiting for you to stop looking." A shudder ran through his body. "When we stayed awake," he whispered, "we saw it. We saw what waits when you dream." The lights flickered. "And what does it want?" the researcher asked, his voice barely audible. Subject One's smile widened, then cracked. "It wants you unconscious," he said, defenseless. A final breath rattled in his chest. "Sleep," he whispered, "is how it feeds." The monitors flatlined. This time, there was no return. Silence fell again, absolute, suffocating. No one spoke. The senior researcher straightened slowly, his legs unsteady. Around him, the others stared in disbelief, horror etched into their faces. "That's impossible," someone muttered. "Sleep is biological. It's necessary." The senior researcher did not answer, because deep inside, something had shifted. That night, long after the chamber was sealed, the bodies removed, the facility locked down, the senior researcher lay alone in his quarters. The lights were on. His eyes were wide open. Every time he blinked, he thought of doors, of something waiting patiently on the other side of unconsciousness. For the first time in his life, he did not look forward to sleep. He feared it, because if Subject One had been telling the truth, then sleep was not rest at all. It was surrender, and whatever waited beyond it had just been reminded that humans could, if pushed far enough, refuse to let go. The question had been answered, and the answer was far worse than ignorance. Lights remained on in every corridor, every laboratory, every observation room. Orders were issued to keep generators running at all costs. No dimming, no darkness, no rest. What had once been a controlled experiment was now a containment situation. Only one subject remained alive, Subject 5. He had survived the chamber opening by censor, by something else entirely, while the others had torn themselves apart or succumbed to injuries that defied explanation. Subject 5 had retreated inward. When the gas stopped, he had collapsed into a catatonic state, breathing shallowly, eyes open but unseeing. He was transferred to a medical ward under armed guard, strapped to a reinforced bed, restrained at the wrists, ankles, chest, and neck. He looked fragile, harmless, almost peaceful. That illusion lasted less than an hour. The monitors showed the same anomaly the researchers had seen before. Elevated consciousness without fatigue markers. His brain activity never dipped. never cycled. It burned steadily, like a flame that refused to flicker. The senior researcher stood at the foot of the bed, hollow-eyed, unshaven, exhausted, in every way except one. He had not slept. None of them had. Sedatives were prepared. "This will force him into REM," a doctor said quietly. "We need to know if sleep reverses the condition." Subject 5's eyes snapped into focus the moment the syringe approached. "No," he said calmly. The word froze. "The rune, you don't understand," the doctor replied. "You're dying." Subject 5 smiled faintly. "We all are," he said, "but I don't have to go there again." Guards tightened their grips on their weapons. "You've been awake for over 15 days, the senior researcher said. "Your body cannot survive this." Subject 5 turned his head slightly, meeting the researcher's gaze. "Your body can't," he corrected. "Mine already adapted." The doctor hesitated. "If you don't sleep, your organs will fail." Subject 5's smile widened, just a little. "That's the choice," he said. "You finally see it." The syringe moved closer. Subject 5 began to struggle. Strength surged through his restrained body far more than his emaciated frame should have possessed. The bed rattled vilely. Straps strained and groaned. "No," he shouted. "You don't know what you're sending me back to." The guards lunged forward, holding him down. The syringe pierced his vein. The sedative flowed in. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Subject 5 screamed. Not like Subject 1 had. This scream was different, focused, desperate, filled with recognition. His back arched violently against the restraints. His eyes rolled back, then snapped forward again, wide with absolute terror. "They're here," he gasped. "They're so close." His body went still. The monitors showed it clearly. Sleep. Within seconds, his heart rate spiked beyond safe limits. His breathing became erratic. Tears streamed from his closed eyes. He was dreaming. "No," the senior researcher whispered. "Wake him up." The doctor tried, shaking him, calling his name, increasing oxygen. Nothing worked. Subject 5's mouth opened. A voice came out. It was not his. Low, calm, familiar in a way that made every person in the room feel suddenly exposed. "Thank you," the voice said. "We don't get many invitations anymore." The lights flickered. One guard screamed and fled the room. Another collapsed, clutching his head. The senior researcher stood frozen. "What are you?" he demanded. The thing using Subject 5's mouth smiled. "We are what you rest for," it said. "What you forget every morning." The monitors screamed as Subject 5's vitals crashed. "You kept him awake," the voice continued. "That was inconvenient." The body convulsed once, then went still. Flatline. Silence returned. The doctor backed away slowly, hands shaking. The senior researcher stared at the corpse. Subject 5 had chosen death over sleep, and the moment sleep was forced upon him, something else had answered. An emergency order was issued immediately. All remaining sedatives destroyed, all sleep studies terminated. Project S-15 erased from records. The facility scheduled for abandonment, but none of that changed what had already happened. That night, the senior researcher sat alone in his office. He stared at the wall. He blinked. Just once, and for the briefest fraction of a second, he felt it, that sensation of falling inward, of letting go. He stood up abruptly, heart pounding, and turned every light on again. Because now he understood the final, terrible truth the subjects had reached before him. Sleep was not something humans needed because it was safe. They needed it because something else needed them to stop watching. And if given the choice through awareness or peaceful ignorance, some minds would rather break than never close their eyes again. The experiment was over, but the choice it revealed would haunt humanity forever. Official records claimed a structural failure, a chemical leak, an incident best left unexplained. Trucks arrived under heavy guard. Files were burned. Hard drives shattered. Walls were scrubbed until they bled gray dust. What could not be erased was buried beneath layers of concrete and snow. Silence reclaimed the forest. But silence, the senior researcher had learned, did not mean absence. He was one of the few who left the facility alive, and he was no longer the same. In the days that followed, he did not sleep. At first, it felt like vigilance and understandable response to trauma. He drank coffee, then stronger stimulants. When those stopped working, he simply stayed awake. Out of fear, every time exhaustion crept in, he remembered Subject 5's scream. Subject 1's smile. The word door. Sleep was no longer neutral. It was hostile. His superiors ordered medical leave. Doctors recommended rest. Sedatives were prescribed. He threw them all away, because he knew now what they truly did. They didn't calm the mind. They lowered the guard. On the 6th night, without sleep, the world began to soften at the edges. Colors dulled, sounds stretched. His reflection in the mirror lagged half a second behind his movements. Still, he refused to close his eyes. On the 9th night, he heard whispering. Not voices' intentions. Familiar thoughts that did not feel entirely his own. They came from the quiet moments when his mind slowed involuntarily. Just rest. You've earned it. We'll take care of everything. He laughed bitterly into the darkness. That's what you said to them, he whispered. The whispers receded, but not far. By the 12th night, his hands shook constantly. His heart felt as though it was beating against resistance, as if his body itself was begging for surrender. He began to understand the subjects more clearly now. Staying awake hurt, but sleeping terrified him. On the 14th night, he dreamed while awake. He saw doors everywhere, closets, hallways. Even his own eyelids reflected in glass. Behind each door was the same sensation. Pressure. Patience. Hunger without emotion. Something waiting. The realization settled into him with terrible clarity. Sleep was not the absence of consciousness. It was a trade. Humans gave up awareness in exchange for mercy, for forgetting, for not seeing what shared the space behind their thoughts. The subjects hadn't gone mad because they stayed awake. They had gone mad because they finally saw uninterrupted reality. On the 15th night, the same number as the experiment, the senior researcher sat alone in his apartment, every light blazing. His vision tunneled. His breathing became shallow. His heart stuttered. The body, deprived too long, no longer asked permission. He slumped forward in his chair. For the first time since the experiment began, he slept. And the door opened. There was no landscape, no dream logic, no symbols, only presence. It did not speak with words. It didn't need to. You understand now. It conveyed. He tried to wake up. He couldn't. You were never meant to stay awake, it continued. Sleep is the agreement. You close your eyes, and we stay where we belong. Panic surged. The others broke the rules, it added. They watched us too long. He felt himself being pulled not physically, but conceptually, like a thought being You don't want to be like them, he promised. The senior researcher screamed inside the dream. He forced himself upward with the last fragment of resistance he had left. His eyes snapped open. He woke gasping on the floor, soaked in sweat, heart racing violently. He had slept for less than a minute, but it had been enough. From that night on, he understood the final truth of the experiment. Sleep deprivation did not create monsters. It removed humanity's blindfold. The human mind was never alone. Sleep was not weakness. It was containment. Years later, on his deathbed, the senior researcher refused morphine, refused sedatives, refused anything that might dull his awareness. As his breathing grew shallow and the room dimmed, a nurse leaned close. Try to rest, she said gently. He smiled faintly, sadly. I know what happens when I do, he whispered. His heart slowed. His eyes remained open, and with his final breath, he left behind a warning the world would never hear. We do not sleep because we are tired. We sleep because something else is waiting, and it prefers us unconscious.